Good afternoon and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Friday program. I'm Georgia Kelly, the director of Praxis. Today, I am delighted to bring back one of my favorite guests, Richard SAKWA, who is live today from Canterbury, England. He is a British political scientist and emeritus professor of Russian and European politics and history at the University of Kent, England. He is also a senior research fellow at the National Research University Higher School of Economics in Moscow. He completed a doctorate on a British Council scholarship at Moscow State University in 1979-80. He also taught at the University of Essex and at UC California, Santa Cruz. He has written several books about Russian and Central and Eastern European history and politics and is the author of The Lost Peace: How the West Failed to Prevent a Second Cold War, which we featured in a Praxis interview in 2024. I want to show you that book because it's the precursor to the book we're going to talk about today. And I'm going to suggest people get both of these books. The Lost Peace, and today we are featuring The Culture of the Second Cold War, which is this one. And it's a shorter book, but it's full of really good things. So I want to welcome you, Richard. It's great to have you back with us today.
Great pleasure to be with you.
Well, I'm going to I guess, starting with the obvious question is for you to talk about the beginning of the Second Cold War. We talked about the First Cold War last time, and now you've written a book about the Second Cold War. So I'd like you to talk about the historic opportunity that you talked about to build a just and sustainable peace internationally that was squandered at the dissolution of the Soviet Union. There was that moment when we could have had the peace dividend we were promised. But instead, quickly on the heels of Gorbachev's exit was the beginning of a second Cold War. So I'd like you to talk about what the second Cold War is, how it started, and what contributed to that.
Yeah, thanks. Just to contextualize it a little bit, it seems to me now that we're meeting in 2025. This is the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. It's also coming up next month, tomorrow, it'll be the 40th anniversary of the coming to power of Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev in the Soviet Union, which, as you all know, opened up a time of massive change, perestroika, of reform, an attempt to build socialism with a human face. But above all, it was, and it just succeeded in putting an end to the First Cold War. Gorbachev not only tried to do domestic reform, but he said in international politics, we have, he argued, the Soviet Union has new political thinking. And this new political thinking had been maturing within the Soviet Union. So it was not imposed from outside, but it actually said, look, we don't need this Cold War. No one needs this Cold War. We can do better. Cold War, in fact, the whole 40 years since the end of the Second World War, well, certainly since 1947, was a type of negative peace, a world teetering on the edge of war. We can do better, especially, and in fact, Gorbachev spoke about this in absolutely visionary terms. But so the Soviet Union put an end to the Cold War. It argued that the West earlier, the Soviet Union had argued that Marxism-Leninism would argue that the West was inherently militaristic, violent, aggressive, colonialist. Maybe they ditched that one a bit too soon. But anyway, we can actually build a positive peace world, a positive peace order. That was a Soviet view. Washington was receptive to a point, but very early on, certainly once George H.W. Bush came in, they very explicitly challenged it. And basically, we have documents which suggest debates between Brent Scowcroft, security advisor, and Bush, which basically said, how dare this upstart Gorbachev, the Soviet Union, take the ideological initiative? We've got to challenge it. And they did. They seized the initiative. In a European context, they said, who needs this common European home? We need a Europe whole and free, which they defined in very different terms, basically arguing that the West, the political West, as I call it, won the Cold War. And that was entirely the opposite logic of what Gorbachev was trying to do, because in arguing we won the Cold War, it perpetuates the logic of Cold War. And that then opened the door to the Second Cold War. Obviously, at its heart was the expansion of the political West, not just NATO, even though loads of promises in 1990 at the time of German unification said they would not enlarge. But it was the whole vision that this political West, or call it what you like, the collective West, the Atlantic power system, whatever, was in some sense the end of history, if you remember at that time, and that the whole world needs to be built on that model. And of course, Russia, as it became independent in December 1991, and the rest of the world, China later, says, well, hang on, guys, that's not the way it should be, and that's not the way it's going to be. And that set up this logic. So the old tension, in short, between communism and capitalism ended, but a whole new phase opened up in which we have this, what we could even call it the global West, which then opened up the vision that its ideals were universal, that its geopolitical dominance was going to have to be set in stone, and anybody who doesn't like it, well, they need to be cut down a peg or two, which is, of course, precisely the logic of Cold War. And that's where we were. And of course, there's all sorts of behaviors associated with it, which are discussed in the book.
Right. There are two different places I could go right now, and they're connected. But I want to start with something you wrote about called the anti-understanding bias in the media. And you termed it the censorship industrial complex. I love that term because I think that's what we're living with, which is the removal of context when we're presented with a problem, a political problem. There's no context. It's like these things happen in a vacuum. And that's really what we hear almost nonstop in our media. Some of the examples are Putin is evil. The October 7th attack had nothing to do with 70 years of displacement and oppression of the Palestinians. Putin never tried to negotiate with Biden before invading Ukraine. This is usually accompanied by the constant recycling of the Hitler meme, which I'm sure you're
Mm.
used to describe all the leaders of all our enemies are Hitler, whether it's Putin, Saddam Hussein, Castro, Assad, the list goes on. It's always Hitler. And I wanted to ask you about how do you see dealing with a media that does this, and how can people inoculate themselves from being manipulated by it? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right about the decontextualization, and even attempts to put forward a context for events is considered illegitimate. Oh, don't bore us with facts and don't burden it, because that, as it were, dilutes the ethical or the moral impetus which the West considers, look, we won the Cold War, you are evil. And as you say, it's like a Marvel comic where a Marvel film where where the evil genius, as it were, emerges fully fledged. And I'll give the example there that they poison the waters. Why? Because they're evil. And why? No background, no context. They emerge fully fledged. And similarly, that evil Putin invaded Ukraine in 2022. Why? What was all the background, as you say, in Gaza as well? All the events in history, and of course the larger context, which is the whole way that the first of all, the first Cold War, then the way it ended, the disappointments, the continuation of the logic of negative peace, which established in European context at least a security dilemma. So you're absolutely right. How do we overcome it? Well, by having sessions like this first, but obviously, that's only the beginning. But what we are witnessing is really the how can I put it? I was going to use the word. I've just come back from France. So I was going to say the démontage or the dismantling of um, the vision of high modernity. I actually quite a great believer where where journalism, which in some corners it still survives, this seeking after truth, after balance, about information. For example, I remember years ago reading a copy of The Scotsman. This is a Scottish newspaper after the 1905 events, and I was trying the Russian First Revolution. And you would have a full page over, or even 2 pages of dense text discussing problems of cattle breeding in the Highlands. Now, I loved that sort of article. The Russian press still has some of those big ones, but you don't see it in the West. Hardly these analytical pieces. In other words, attention span is deprived. But at the same time, as always, there's a counter tendency, and the people are looking. There's Consortium News, there's this outlet, there's all sorts, especially in the United States, a rich ecosystem. Ecosystem, as an ECO as opposed to ECHO, ecosystem of people who are, discussing and thinking about questions, and that is encouraging. Unfortunately, not much sign of that in the United Kingdom at the moment.
Yeah, I've noticed that. You noticed that in the book that diplomacy has been subordinated to ideological imperatives. And we, of course, know the word negotiation is really rarely ever mentioned in our media. It's like it ceases to exist. And during the Biden administration, I never heard the word negotiation ever. And I'd like you to comment on that. What has happened to the idea of negotiation, where even progressives I know are viewing it as capitulation in terms of Ukraine? So I'd like you to explain a little bit about why this is happening and what could be done about it.
Yeah. So indeed, capitulation or appeasement, as you say, for the Hitler analogy, for some people, it's always 1938. It's always Munich, and it's always appeasement. Uh, what we can do about it, funnily enough, well, strangely enough, or weirdly enough, this Biden, of course, didn't speak to Putin again after their last telephone call was on I think, the 30th of December, 2021. And so over 3 years of war, they never spoke. And Blinken, of course, as a US chief diplomat, precisely refused to say, considering negotiations and diplomacy a privilege, a gift. But of course, that's precisely the opposite. In other words, the United States was practicing anti-diplomacy, using all mechanisms to delegitimate the interlocutor rather than to talk. And obviously, diplomacy is about negotiating difference. So what we can do about it, it's interesting that unfortunately, it has taken a maverick figure, Donald J. Trump, to start a discussion. And whatever one thinks about him, and indeed obviously a very flawed vessel, he actually is opening up the door to negotiation. And it's the classical old-fashioned democratic, with a small d, establishment, including, for example, Keir Starmer in Britain, Macron in France, and, well, slightly different Scholz in Germany, but who absolutely refuse to negotiate, who continue. Basically, it's an ethical crusade. And the reason is they see the world in Manichaean, black and white terms, as we were saying earlier. So, how to transcend it is patient argumentation. Some of you mentioned the Jeffrey Sachs speech to the European Parliament. John Mearsheimer, of course, is very active, and Glenn Deason and so many others are putting out and debating and examining the facts and the context. So that's all we can do. And of course, my little working at the coalface of knowledge is putting out those books.
Right, which is excellent, and really good for us in terms of educating ourselves about what is happening. I mean, I remember we tend to look at the New York Times or MSNBC as reputable sources of information. And yet I think it's very good to go back to 1990, it was, I think, when Judith Miller on the front page of the New York Times was talking about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And of course, they didn't exist. But this is an example of where propaganda is in our mainstream media all the time. And, it doesn't seem to get questioned. And that's, I think, one of the things we're trying to do with programs like this. You also mentioned, or I want to get to NATO, because I think we have to talk about NATO in relationship to Russia, Ukraine. So I'd just like you to mention maybe what you see happening as NATO started moving east to the
Mm.
point where it was surrounding Russia, and how this has impacted the Russia-Ukraine war.
just to say on your previous point, WMD, another way to decipher that is to call it weapons of mass disinformation. Those organs you just mentioned, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and of course the whole pleiad in Britain, The Guardian, which is just a shadow of its former self, and the Telegraph and the Times, of course. But as for NATO, uh, the thing is that NATO is symbolic, and so when people say it isn't NATO as such, but it was the way it was done, because NATO may actually have a useful purpose in the way, in a sense that it tempers conflicts within Europe itself. Say, for example, between Greece and Turkey, and any border conflicts, Slovakia versus Hungary, and so on. But it needed to be embedded in a larger pan-European continental security order. Even Zbigniew Brzezinski, in his book The Grand Chessboard of 1997, argued a passionate advocate of NATO enlargement. But even he said, well, we've got to have a good security treaty with Russia. Even he said that. So, but of course, the Clintonites absolutely refused to accept that. So, I mean, NATO enlargement was that worm in the apple of Concord, which could have grown into a a tree after the end of the Cold War. And of course, the debate started right at the beginning, at the time of German unification, the debate in February 1990, when James Baker, US Secretary of State, said, NATO not enlarged, not an inch eastward. And then the endless debates going into 1994 when Boris Yeltsin assumed, initially in the early 90s, he thought, and he was led to believing even, that the idea of partnership for peace would be the alternative, in which Russia would be an equal member. And when he was told in December 1994 by Clinton that, no, we're going to enlarge NATO, he was absolutely furious. He was the one, and he then used the term the Cold Peace. In other words, a continuation of Cold War for the containment of Russia. By the way, Jeffrey Sachs gives a lot of information about when, in July 1991, he argued that the Soviet Union should be supported financially and also politically. And Washington gave him short shrift. They piled the money into Poland, but they said, why on earth should we help the Soviet Union? And then the same thing applied to Russia. So it set a set of events in motion. Which began under Gorbachev, continued under Yeltsin, and it was Putin who, when he came in to power as president in the year 2000, who argued, look, we've got to deal with this. And he suggested, look, why don't we join it? Why doesn't Russia join it? In a famous interview with David Frost in the year 2000, David Frost asked him, can Russia join NATO? And Putin said, "I почему нет?" And why not? But of course, he again got, and so it went on all the way. Interestingly enough, since we last spoke, obviously the turning point was Putin's speech in the Munich Security Conference in February 2007. But it's an interesting bookending to this whole epoch. J.D. Vance's in the Munich Security Forum a few days ago, when he basically, people would say, echoed some of the arguments made by Putin in 2007, obviously in a different context, and he certainly wasn't talking about NATO as such. But the implication was, well, finally, Putin had a point. Moscow has a point that, we in the West are not so perfect. And this moment of introspection is finally come to hit us. And in fact, some of you may have seen today's meeting of Zelensky and Trump and J.D. Vance in the White House, in which it became quite a nasty little debate. And basically, Vance was saying to Zelensky, don't tell us what we're doing. Don't try to shape US policy, because the West's policy was hijacked by the East Europeans, that we've seen an Easternization of the European Union, and we've seen a Ukrainization of Western politics more broadly. That is, an intolerant, undemocratic, exclusive type of and militaristic behavior. This war, just to say, it led to this war, but it could have been avoided. Simple words. I mean, I think I've said it many times, and Jeffrey Sachs in the European Parliament quoted it again. we, or that is Ukraine, will not join NATO. It was not in prospect anyway. All they had to say was, okay, we'll defer for an indefinite time. But they didn't, and we are, as Edward III used to say, it is as it is.
Hmm. I want you to mention something about the sanctions that the US has put on Russia, because I don't feel many people understand the depth of this punishment that has been leveled on Russia. It's an interesting juxtaposition because when the US invaded Iraq, Russia didn't put sanctions on the US, but we see that we put sanctions on anyone who does anything that we don't like. So I think to just give us an example of some of the sanctions that have been placed on Russia, how many and how they've blocked the SWIFT banking system, how they had to create their own way of transferring funds between countries, and also that the US actually froze some of Russia's assets in our banks.
It's a relatively small amount in US banks, but it was about 260,000, sorry, 268 billion dollars in Euroclear in Brussels. So it's nearly, basically in total, about 300 billion dollars have effectively been sequestered. And of course, people like Zelensky are calling for them to be confiscated. And Ursula von der Leyen, European Commission president, is also calling for that, which would be an act of theft. But as for the sanctions, Russia is the most sanctioned country in the world. I think the total now is about 28,000. That includes personal ones. And absolutely across the board, including, for example, as you know, banning direct flights. Some countries still allow it, Serbia, Turkey. But basically, no direct flights from the United States or mainland Europe to Moscow or to Russia. Unprecedented. So, in other words, a grandmother cannot go cannot easily go and see a grandchild, and so on. It is unprecedented, which includes also against sanctions against Russian energy exports, financial movements, individuals, corporations, and of course dual-use goods. So it's unprecedented, and more than that, it's also sanctioning extraterritorial third countries, third who are considered to be undermining the sanctions regime. So it's absolutely, and of course, it's a reflection of double standards, as you suggest, is that when the West, in that book you mentioned of Robinson and Chomsky, they describe in detail how the United States intervened 54 times during the First Cold War and dozens of times since the end in the Second Cold War, and of course, no sanctions. And that's a reflection of US exorbitant privilege. They talk about the role of the US dollar, but in general, the fact that until recently, it could get away with these things because of its enormous financial and economic and political power. But it seems that that is coming to an end.
I wanted to ask you about the UN. With the Security Council, it seems like almost nothing can happen.
Mm.
But I wanted to get your opinion of any possibilities of the UN actually helping to negotiate or being part of negotiations. Is that something that's even possible?
It's essential. It's only the United Nations can sanction the use of force legitimately, international force, of course. So it's essential. And by the way, only the United Nations can impose sanctions, obviously not just bilateral ones, but multilateral sanctions. And so, in other words, the measures taken by the United States and its allies are unilateral coercive measures and illegal in international law. So the West, in its claims to be defending international law and the rules-based order, is actually, in its very actions, is undermining it. As for the United Nations, it's now under unprecedented threat. I mentioned we're celebrating the 80th anniversary of the Second World War, and of course the 80th anniversary of the United Nations, and we see it being marginalized by Ukraine, by uh, uh, by by Israel, of course, and so many other states, and by the political West more broadly. It was used as an instrument to continue conflict rather than a forum for the resolution of conflict. So, but my argument has been that the the United Nations is at the heart of something bigger, the Charter International System. Established in 1945, it's not just the UN Charter, it's all the subsequent bodies, developments, institutions, which, as we know, the World Health Organizations, UNCTAD, and in Palestine, UNRWA, United Nations Relief Works Administration, and so much more, UNESCO. It's a vast system, which is in some ways, and the Charter itself is the constitution of the world. The United Nations is not a world government, and I don't want it to be one, but it sets out what is legal and illegal in international politics. So it's certainly something to be defended. Uh, yeah, I was going to say more, but maybe that'll be your next
I just wanted
question.
to ask you, do you think there should be a dissolution of the Security Council or that it should change? Because it seems like that's one of the problems of getting things done.
You, it certainly should have extra members. So obviously India, but then when I speak to people in Pakistan, they say, look, why not should it just be India? Why not Pakistan? But it's tough. And then, of course, Brazil, and then they'd say, why not Argentina? And obviously from Africa. But, I think that, obviously any destabilization of the United Nations today could threaten its very existence. So it certainly is far from perfect, but it's basically the best we've got. And I mean, I was asked because I'm quite active, have been in the United Kingdom, in the United Nations Association, and they've got a working party, and they're focusing on trying to weaken the veto powers of the Permanent Five, the P5, in the Security Council. I'm not at this stage, I'm not sure that's the most important thing, but perhaps more powers to the United Nations General Assembly, that may be welcome. But still, the United Nations has survived these 80 years. What we do need is to go back to the spirit in which the United Nations was established. That is the spirit of what I nowadays call comity, COMITY, of cooperation, and that spirit of 1945, when the great powers came together to establish a system. So, in other words, we could tinker and change the organization as much as we like, but it's ultimately it's the ethos which is important, and it's their ethos which has drained away in recent times.
You mentioned the last thing I'm going to say in your book, and you can comment on it if you'd like. You mentioned the dialectical approach stresses the clash of opposites rather than cooperative modes of conflict
Mm,
resolution or cooperation, that the good versus evil instead of a dialogic approach where all sides change as a result
mm,
of engagement. That is such an important thing to understand, that all sides would change as a result of engagement. And this is what conflict resolution is supposed to be about, and what real honest negotiation would be about, rather
mm,
than horse trading. So, wondered if you have any more words you'd like to say about that before I open it up to
mm.
questions.
Yeah, it's absolutely what I call in the book the dialogical approach, and it comes from Mikhail Bakhtin's study of Dostoevsky. And if you remember those Dostoevsky novels, Crime and Punishment or The Brothers Karamazov, in which the actors, the characters, talk and talk and then talk yet more and yet more, but at the end they have all changed, and but that assumes, and that's why a dialogical approach is opposed to a dialectical one, if you like, which assumes or that that we have all the answers. So what's the point of talking to you? What's the point of changing? Because we're so good. That is the vision of the political West. Can I just say that just before you open up, just to say a little bit of a context, to say that what's so difficult at this moment with well, a change of the political West, but also with the emergence of Donald J. Trump to the presidency at the moment. He is challenging this political West. He's acting as an icebreaker, and he's obviously threatening the traditional view of the Atlantic power system, but he's opening up spaces which have been closed not just for the 40 years, even perhaps 80 years since 1947. But, and this is so that you could say you could welcome the opening up, not the way he does it, but the idea, the fact itself. But at the same time, he is, he's condemning, and J.D. Vance even more, the old models of globalism and all the rest. But they're also challenging the fundamental vision of dialogue, which is that of sovereign internationalism at the heart of the United Nations system. That, in other words, today we have 193 states, all equal legally, of course, but equally in an ethical sense. They're equal. And hence we have multipolarity. And the international system since the last 80 years has matured. We've had decolonization, we've moved now. And it's not just the great powers, Russia, US, China, India, but medium powers, Indonesia, Mexico, whole Philippines, so many others, Brazil, South Africa, no longer accept the old games. And this is what's different in this second Cold War, is that so much of the global South is refusing to play the endless war games of the global North. And in fact, so many have told me, we in Europe in particular, we started the First World War, dragged in the rest of the world. We started the Second World War, dragged in the rest of the world. And they say, look, guys, we're not going to be dragged into your Third World War. We want nothing to do with it. So that is slightly optimistic, is that this charter system, which is bigger than the United Nations, has matured. And that's why I so much try to, say we need to defend it, however imperfect it may be.
Kind of like the non-aligned movement that we talked about
Exactly.
last time. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So I want to open this up to questions. If people have questions for Richard SAKWA, this would be the time to. Jeffrey, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm wondering, we're all very suspicious of Trump.
Mm.
And rightly so. I think it's the art of the fudge rather than the art of the deal. And I'm wondering what your take is on some of the opinions, thinking that this is part of the pivot towards Asia. In other words, he wants to finish off this war with Ukraine and somehow pry Russia away from the Chinese-Russia alliance in order to have more of a leeway in dealing with China.
Yeah, uh, absolutely. But I'll say two things to that. As far as I understand it, in Washington, the old neocons and so on are fighting back, and the Democrats, with a small d or big D even, basically arguing that there's how do we go about it? Yes, that the premise is right, but one school says, look, we've got to, as it were, make nice with Russia to peel it away from China, as you say, so that then they can focus on what they would consider the main enemy, China. But there's another school which is saying, look, any concession to Russia in Ukraine and anything else will open up and mean that Eurasia, that whole vast continent, would slip away from US dominance, and that we can't allow. And Russia would then emerge as an independent actor. And they'd saying, look, we've spent the last 35 years trying to weaken Russia, to try to undermine it. We effectively maneuvered and manipulated this war in Ukraine to impose a strategic defeat on Russia, and we now need to double down. The Ukrainians look as if they're willing to fight, so we just give them more weapons, more money, and they're willing to destroy their nation in the cause of weakening Russia. What's not to like about it, as Lindsey Graham has been saying more than once, no American soldiers died, and yet they could impose a strategic defeat. So in Washington, there are people whispering to Trump to say, don't give up now. And Keir Starmer and Macron, who visited Washington this week, are making that argument. Can you believe it? We Europeans want the war to continue effectively. And it's Trump who's saying no. And, so you're absolutely right. Can I just say the substantive point that it is a fantasy to believe that Russia and China will split. They won't. They are aligned. It's not an alliance. It's not a bloc. It's not an alliance, but it is an alignment. And it's an alignment which makes sense for both of them, whatever happens. First of all, I don't trust the West anymore, so that isn't going to work. And second, they've got a 6,000-kilometer border. And so the last thing they want is to open that up again, as they did in the last Soviet years. And third, they actually are normatively, that is, aligned. And I'd go so far, in support of the Charter principles. Obviously, they don't apply it and implement it as fully as we would like, but nevertheless, they are not revisionist, if you like. They're not trying to destroy the international system. They're trying to undermine the dominance of the political West, and to which even Trump is even saying that's actually run out. So, what Trump has done is established, reintroduced huge dynamism and fluidity into international politics. And I welcome it personally. As I said, a very flawed vessel, and there's a danger that he throws the baby of charter internationalism out with the bathwater of Western imperialist supremacy. But nevertheless, it's it's a liminal moment, an openness in a historical situation. As I said, it happened 80 years ago at the end of the Second World War. We had this openness of history. We had it 40 years ago, beginning with Gorbachev, and we're now 40 years or 80 years and 40 years later, with the coming of Trump, we're in this open moment with all, good things and bad things associated with it.
Mhm.
We have other questions? I think one of the areas that people are talking about a lot is the support for Ukraine has come to mean support for their continued war. And that's been a real problem among a lot of progressives who equate support with Ukraine as supporting the war to continue. And I'd like you to comment on that a little.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, many people would dismiss this, but I've always said for the last 20 odd years, if not more, that the best friends of Ukraine are those who try to protect it as a sovereign, independent, democratic state. And to do that, it has to be aware that it lives in a dangerous, anarchical world, that it lives next door to a neighbor, which has security concerns of its own. And so those best friends would have been to say, let's avert the war. And now the best friends are those who say, let's stop it. Let this destruction stop, as Trump puts it so eloquently. Thousands are dying and the destruction of cities and so on. Yep. So you're absolutely right. Of course, it's. I mean, and can I just say another thing? I've met so many. There is another Ukraine. So, as you say, to overcome this, it isn't just a question of a ceasefire. That's pointless. A truce, nothing. It would be just basically like, as you know, the Korean War ended in 1953 with a demilitarized zone, but the two sides are effectively still at war, so not fighting. And this is how many years since then, 70 odd more. So a truce isn't enough. And there's four elements to a peace deal. The first one is a peace within Ukraine between its multicultural, multilingual identities. And so the other Ukraine needs to be brought in, and we need a generous constitutional settlement within Ukraine for Russian language, but all languages, Hungarian, Romanian, Yiddish, whatever, all needs to be protected. Rather than this narrow nationalistic vision of an ethnically clear, clean Ukraine, which is the vision that won in the Maidan in 2014. That's the first thing. And we need a Russo-Ukrainian reconciliation. It's no good a ceasefire with the war. Everybody's saying, and they're right, for a ceasefire for 6 months, 2 years, whatever, and then one side or the other then starts shooting again. We need a genuine reconciliation because contrary to Samuel Huntington, remember years ago this clash of civilizations idea, and that we're talking about two orthodox civilizations, East and Slavic. So there has to be reconciliation, and amazingly enough, despite the awfulness, it's not just Ukrainians are bitter against Russia today, and understandably so, obviously, but also Russians bitter against the Ukrainians who allowed themselves to become a tool in geopolitical games that they didn't understand. The third level is, of course, a European security order. And the fourth one is a US-Russian great power committee, to go back to the spirit of the Elbe in 1945. So that's right. And how do we get there? Is first of all by analyzing in the way that I've done and so many others who are doing exactly that. We need, in other words, to solve the small issues, you need to deal with the big ones. And, in other words, it's not going to be another Minsk agreement. and it's not going to be another Yalta. So a Yalta 2 where the great powers, but maybe a Yalta 2 opens the door to a larger, and then perhaps we could have another Helsinki conference of the sort we had in August 1975, where in which all the European powers and the US and Canada, though I don't think Canada should be invited unless it's got a new leadership. Or maybe, so I don't want to say anything nasty about Canada, but certainly it's been the most militant in its support for a military solution. And there is no military solution to the Ukraine crisis.
That's another problem. Military solutions are us,
Yeah.
with our war industrial complex. I remember when the Cold War supposedly ended and the USSR was no longer in existence, and we were promised that peace dividend. And I remember thinking, how are they going to sabotage this?
Yeah.
Because we've got this military industrial complex. They're not going to let this go. And sure enough, they didn't let it go. That's what the next Cold War and the NATO expansion has been all about. And it's sad that one would be so cynical and say, where are they going to come in and destroy this peace dividend? But that is what happened. And I'd like you to just talk a little bit about Russia, Ukraine, US, NATO as a proxy war, since I don't see any other questions right now. But
Yeah.
I'm welcoming other questions, but I don't see people's hands up.
There is one. I can see two hands.
Okay, well, let him go. Walter, go ahead.
Thank you. Hopefully I'll get this organized. Thank you for being here, Dr. SAKWA. In regard to, I don't view these things with certain types of terms like evil, and I get the point. I've seen that in media plenty of times. I have another question after this, but I certainly don't see Putin as a good person. What my central question, though, is in regard to the Ukraine war. I get the argument that Russia was provoked. I come from a criminal defense background, among other things, and we deal with actually murder cases where we have a defense that the person was provoked. But still, the moral concept is it's still a crime. The question is, at what level? And so I still don't see the justification for the invasion of Ukraine. And I don't see how that is, I guess, rationalized. The other thing, too, I did read.
Shall I answer that first?
Oh, sure.
For a second? Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because it's an excellent question. It's a very good question. Yep. So, I think that's a very good way of framing it. That however provoked somebody may be, or even a country, you don't need to react to the provocation, and there's no justification in law. And by extrapolating your argument, you could slightly, then of course, if you had the lawyer for the defense, they would then quote Article 51 of the UN Charter, which is the right to self-defense. And I don't know how you as a lawyer would then deal with say, look, I was feeling threatened and I don't know what level of, threat. What I would say, of course, is that I'm opposed to war, and I certainly do not, and I've never done that, endorsed the invasion. I think it was the idea of, in a world, anytime, bombing. And of course, Russia was very careful at the beginning. It didn't do what the Anglo-Americans did in their usual war, as we did in Iraq and Libya, which is, the shock and awe. And I have statistics in the book I'm working, that is the US, UK, dropped more bombs in the first 24 hours than Russia did in the first 28 days. And everybody was astonished. The US military attaché said, why didn't they do it? Why didn't they really destroy absolutely every single military and complex and so on? Obviously, Ukraine is far bigger than the other countries. But in other words, they did. This invasion was considered to be a special military operation, is what they call it, and it was meant to be a surgical intervention, and it was designed as a part of coercive diplomacy. Now, only thing I'm saying now is simply to give you the context, is not to endorse or justify it at all, because I think that all sides behaved, provoked it. Zelensky bears a huge responsibility for the war. Biden bears Biden and his teams, such like, and of course Putin and his team. So it's not obviously to endorse it, but just like the beginning of the First World War, and the debates continue well over 100 years ago about it, and that's our job. My job, certainly as an academic, is to give all sides to it. And such like. As for Putin, you could say, like him or not, that ultimately he did almost everything possible to avert this war. And if it wasn't Putin, it may have been far, far worse with a Shmutin or Tutin who would out there. And more than that, he is even now, and I know Russians who are telling me now when they're starting to talk with Trump. First of all, they're saying, don't believe a word any American leader ever says. They've basically swindled us for the last 30 odd years, in the last 500 years. First and second, they're saying to Putin that Putin is going to give the game away again, that he's going to compromise, he's going to go for peace. And after all the sacrifices we've done, we should finish the job. That is, remove the danger that they're going to put this Aegis ashore military launchers in Ukraine with Tomahawk nuclear tipped weapons, which take about 2 minutes to get to Moscow, 300, 400 kilometers. Anybody in Moscow will say no. They will not. They've already put them in Poland and they've put them in Romania. So there was a genuine threat out there, and that threat has not gone away unless we have that package peace deal of which I talked. But I mean, yeah, and a really great question. And the historians and academics will be debating this, and public activists for years to come. So yeah, so good.
Have,
Thanks for the question.
I have a real quick last comment. I know Katie wants to talk. Um, and you know, I certainly see and I read an awful lot. So I feel threatened, so therefore I attack. That's what we did in Iraq, preemptive strike. And believe me, I have a number of things that we have done wrong. However, as my own particular comment, nevertheless, I live here in the West. I don't live over there. And I'm not so sure that if things were reversed, that things would be much, much better, really. And it's an unfortunate, brutal world that we do live in. It's more of a Hobbesian view on my part. But thank you so much, Dr. Sakwa. Katie, I don't want to use your time.
But just to say what you just said, sorry, before you come in, Katie, is that obviously the Cuban Missile Crisis is that we did see how a country reacted when it was perceived to be in danger. And so that's, what was it, 13 days in October 1962, and I've argued, and I do, that the Ukraine war is a slow motion Cuban Missile Crisis. Russia's doing what Washington did in 1962. Again, not to justify it, but it's because possibly.
Well, we removed our nuclear warheads from Turkey.
You did. It wasn't. It was only announced years later. Your Jupiter missiles. Yeah. No, and no, absolutely right. You did, and there was this deal. And all credit to Kennedy for that, by the way. Absolutely.
Kennedy Khrushchev.
Yeah.
Negotiation. So, Katie, did you have a question? She's mute. You're mute, Katie. Maybe she doesn't. I think she's talking, but you're mute, Katie. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
I said hi to Richard and thank you, and hello to Walter. Good to see you, and nice to see everybody here. I appreciate the conversation. So I wanted to circle us back around a little bit to our beginning in the conversation here, the idea of the concept of negotiation having gotten lost in the shuffle. I'm going to give it a teeny bit of context. This morning, I was on a surprising dialogue, a stream of comments, and surprised to see the amount of attack and stupidity going on locally among people obviously uneducated. And I was really depressed by the amount of combat going on just between people of different sides. And my background is psychotherapist of 50 years. So my question has to do with how do we, each of us here, sitting here, and how do we as a people do something to make, recreate or put value again on the idea of dialogue. You talked about dialectic, etc. In my experience, that's kind of considered, oh, that's what people do in therapy, but we don't have dialogue in America anymore. We
Yeah.
have fighting. And so, how do we build that back? I mean, really take action around that, around building value, the value of dialogue and negotiation. And why has the United Nations, at least in the conversations we've had in this group, seems to be minuscule in its
Mm,
power?
mm. No, it's certainly the thing is that the United Nations is a combination of two things. It is the equality of nations, as we see embedded in the UN General Assembly, but it's also a forum for great powers, and that's how we managed to get the United States, for example, to buy in, as it didn't after the end of the First World War when the League of Nations was established. And that's why we have this Security Council with the 5 permanent members. So it's a sort of incompatible elements. Yeah, but you're right. One of the reasons is, of course, is that the political West believed it did win the Cold War and the Second World War, of course, it did, and therefore, after the end of the First Cold War, it radicalized and it closed out the space. And what we then had, what happened was is that the political West, calling itself the rules-based order, the liberal international order, and equivalents, basically substituted for the United Nations. And the Britain and United States in particular, usually with France going along, has then tried to use and substitute for the United Nations. And that's why I've been arguing in all these books and works is to say we need to reconstitute this United Nations at the heart of an international system, separate and distinct from this political Western Atlantic power system, and to say, look, even us, Washington, Moscow, Beijing, New Delhi, etc., you guys, you need to first of all, subordinate yourself not just to the great power and the international law side of the Charter, but the Charter's got lots of other good things in it. I mean, it's got everything good in it. Obviously, the UN Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 and so many other elements, the social rights ones of 1966, so much which was important there. And that is the foundation. What I'd love to see is more a revival of the United Nations Association. When it's in the United Kingdom, I speak at various meetings up and down the land for the UNA, but the average age, I'm afraid, is not young. And when it began, for example, my friend at Cambridge was telling me in the 1960s, 70s, when he was a student there and chair of the United Nations Association, it was the biggest student association at the University of Cambridge. Hundreds of members with enthusiasm and the idea that this is how we can overcome great power conflict and this endless logic of conflict, and indeed all the psychological fighting which goes along, attended by a Cold War. Cold War, of course, isn't just great power politics. It's the demonization of the enemy. It's that their character, that the only way to overcome this conflict is they have to change to become like us. But no, look, we're civilizationally different. China would say, what impertinence. We are a civilization that's lasted 5,000 years, and the United States, a mere upstart. What, soon you'll be celebrating, I think, the 250th anniversary. Is that it? Or whatever. Anyway, just a mere blink in Chinese terms, and of course, so on. And they're saying simply, I mean, what are you saying? That we want to become like and that's why, we're talking about, I say, to defend genuine internationalism, not globalism. Globalism is when you have to become like us to accept the dominance and the power play, and indeed all our ethical, cultural norms and wokeism, as they would now say, as J.D. Vance would say. But no, we've got our own values. And, Russia's an Orthodox civilization. China is a Neo-Confucian, or a blend of Neo-Confucianism and communism, Marxism. Well, let it find its own way to modernity. So it's tolerance as well as dialogue. Tolerance, empathy, understanding, based on the UN Charter. So it's not just an abstraction. and don't forget China, the Soviet Union, the Arab world all participated in devising the charter. Obviously, the United States took a leading part in it, and congratulations, well done, great achievement. But don't then try to subvert your own interest, which of course Donald J. Trump is now doing, and that is, as I say, throwing out the baby with the bathwater.
Yeah, Katie brought up an interesting point about negotiations, because one thing I noticed when I was living in the former Yugoslavia and the country just fell apart into a civil war is that the negotiators that would come in to try and prevent the war from spreading to the next state really didn't know how to negotiate. It's like they were the people making the war. And we don't have real negotiators negotiating. It's like they're still the people who are in the government or who are in the war, but they're not trained in conflict resolution. They're not trained in the kind of I guess the system that you're talking about, where you change as a process of negotiating. They don't know anything about that idea. And I don't know how you bring in real negotiators who understand how to deal with conflict on a mature level instead of a punitive level. That seems to be one of the things we're dealing with also.
Absolutely, I agree with that completely. That it has to be an openness to the views of the other, and a willingness to adapt, to modify, to compromise. Absolutely, and instead of which we've had this absolutism over the last few years, which. But as I say, I can, if my little vision of 40-year segments of history does work, well, we're entering into a new segment, which is maybe where the discussions we're having, the discussions that Jeffrey Sachs is having, and all the others may be able to influence it to say, look, guys, you've messed it up twice, after 1945 and after 1985. Let's hope after 2025 we can really start thinking about, well, and we're not reinventing the wheel. That's the key thing, because you just said, we're always saying is, let us fulfill the potential and the promise of the Charter internationalism, which Gorbachev tried to reboot after 1985 as well, in his famous speeches to the United Nations. And, well, who is the leader today? Well, we know who is sitting in the White House. Paradoxically, I mean, Kissinger said this a few years ago. Again, I don't particularly like quoting him, but he said there comes along in history a person who may be, volia nevolia, as we say in Russian, who, against his own will becomes the instrument of a historical process that perhaps they're semi-conscious of what actually they're doing. As I say, but then, of course, we then need to say no, and US citizens in particular, defend the United Nations, US participation in the World Health Organization, UNCTAD, and all the other things. We hope that hopefully that you can get to your, well, that in other words, when you throw out globalism, don't throw out internationalism with it.
Well put. Thank you so much, Richard, for being with us today. We're at the hour, and I know you've got another important traveling to do tomorrow, so I don't want to take all your time, but I really appreciate you explaining all these things to us, taking the time to answer our questions. It's been wonderful. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you as well, Doctor. Thank you, Georgia.